to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing The Illusion of Love, Why the Bartered Woman Returns to Her Abuser by David Celani. So this book is very important because it's going to talk about the dynamics between the bartered woman and her abuser in a way that is very professional, meaning that David Celani wrote this book first and foremost for professionals, but you can also read it if you're a layman, but you're going to need a lot of patience and to perhaps reread a couple of chapters. So very interestingly enough, this topic is one of those topics in which even mental health professionals aren't that well trained about, because it's one of those things that, as David Celani points out in his book, is still very much a taboo in our society. We are uncomfortable talking about it, and we are uncomfortable unraveling it. However, he, in this book, is going to take a deep dive into what is happening. So for Celani, he doesn't take the common theory that bartering could happen to anyone and everyone. He's somewhat against Walker's theory of violence, because he feels that Walker does not really go into the internal dynamics of what is happening, that she's only at a surface level, and her analysis is more political than psychological in essence, which is a very interesting criticism and one which holds, I feel, a lot of value. However, and I must preface this, what David Celani is saying is that there is internal reasons, not that there is a fault in the bartered woman. That's very important. She's not responsible for her internal patterns. She is a victim of her internal patterns. But if we do not analyze the patterns, then they repeat. Whereas Walker's theory does not take into account any patterns. She dismisses patterns by fear that we would blame women for their patterns. But Celani says we can't do that. That's unscientific and it's counterproductive in the end. So why does the phenomena of the bartered woman occur? Well, one will start with childhood. Unfortunately, these women have suffered immense trauma, abuse, belittlement, neglect, humiliation, rejection, abandonment, you name it. They have unfortunately had a very unstable household, which hasn't allowed them to develop a stable sense of self. So what is happening, and is very important here, is that instability is going to continue well into adulthood. So to explain this phenomena, David Celani is going to present the endopsychic structure with a kind of a twist on it. So for those of you who haven't seen my other videos, the endopsychic structure is a Fernbergian theory that cuts away from Freudian analysis to pure object theory, meaning that for Fernberg and for Celani by extension, there is no such thing as drive-seeking pleasure, right? It's about the object, i.e. the relationship. And why is that? Well, it's because when we start out life, we are in complete and full dependency on the adult, on the caregiver. There is no life without the caregiver. And the infant knows that at the very core. So what's going to happen is that the infant is going to need a lot of support to develop an autonomous sense of self. A support that unfortunately in unstable or destructive or hateful environments the child isn't going to get. So the child is going to be confronted to terrible caregivers, frightening caregivers. And what's going to happen then? What's going to happen is that instead of internalizing good and happy memories, which would be the basis of a stable self, of a central ego in Fernberg, and for Celani a real self, what's going to happen to those children is that they're going to internalize that they are bad. So why are they going to internalize that badness? They're going to internalize that badness to wash clean the parent. They're gonna use what Fernburn calls a moral defense to absorb all the badness of the parent into themselves. By doing that, they become bad, but the parent becomes good. And this is important because by doing so, the unconscious reasoning behind it is that if I might be bad, but if I'm bad and dependent upon someone good, then there is a chance, an ultimate chance of saving me, of freeing me of my suffering. However, if the person I depend upon is bad and evil, even if I'm good, I'm lost. I have lost everything. Therefore, unconsciously, I have to become bad. I have to absorb the badness in me. I have to blame myself for all the abuse, all the suffering that is pushed upon me, so that I can then fundamentally encapsulate all the badness within me. And parent becoming all good will fix me. So that's pretty much the moral defense in a nutshell. It's the absorption of the badness. And we can see that in the bartered woman case, she often absorbs the badness inside of herself. She will often say things like, oh, it's my fault, I did not clean the dishes, I deserved to be hit, I should have done this, I should have done that, and all of those things are rationalizations. She's not at fault for what has happened, but she feels like it because the alternative, being dependent and having to submit to someone evil, is just something that is too hard, because that's what she experienced during her whole childhood. So she's repeating the same pattern of trying to absorb the badness to free the other one and for the other one to become good. But it's always a failure. The second defense that they will use is splitting. So it's splitting of the self and splitting of the other. So what is splitting? It's dividing good and bad. So as I said, she absorbs the bad, but it's not only that. She also divides two types of self. A hopeful self and an abusive self. So those are a rebranding of Celani, of Fernburn's concept of libidinal ego for the hopeful self and anti-libidinal ego for the abused self. So the hopeful self is going to be very, very hopeful that the relationship can become good, can somehow come back to what it was or what it should be. So the hopeful self is going to do everything in its power to try and get back that relationship, even through suffering. And what can be very impressive from the outside is that every bad sin that has happened to the bartered woman is kind of denied. She does not have contact with that in her mind. Therefore, when you confront her with what has happened, it happens that there is a denial, that she doesn't even recognize that, or she will say things that it's in the past, that he has changed, and so on and so forth. And what can be very, very strange for a clinician that isn't prepared is that you do get those types of intense reactions that even if you start criticizing, she's going to start attacking you verbally. So in a way, that hopeful self does everything it can to maintain the relationship and to save the object, fundamentally, the relationship itself. Then we have the abused self, in which fundamentally, when it goes too far, when the bartering occurs, after the bartering, the woman can feel that all of the relationship has to go, everything has to go. And you might think, well, that's good, that's great, it's just what's going to be needed to separate. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, because the abuser then basically makes his victim shift into a hopeful self again. So the abused self is more workable with than the hopeful self, but it's still very difficult, as Celani points out. So what makes these patterns occur? Well, for Celani, there's three things on a developmental level that the child unfortunately didn't have. As Mahler points out, there's three phases, and there's Mahler's ideas are differentiation, introjection, and individuation. Or it's individuation before introjection. Anyway, for Mahler, there is a state where the parent is going to differentiate both themselves from their children, that they're different, and they will welcome the autonomy of the child. And also they will name the emotional experience of the child. Oh, you're hurt, or you're sad, you're hopeful, and so on and so forth. So they're gonna help the child navigate their emotional experience. However, in the case of bartered women and other forms of abuse, the parent doesn't do that. The parent prevents the child from differentiating, and he merges the child with them, creating a sort of like extension of themselves within the child, instead of letting the child go. And often in these cases, they also use the child to fulfill their needs instead of helping the child fulfill theirs. They also do not differentiate the emotional baggage of the child, meaning the child is lost within his own emotions. And after that, what happens is that the individuation process, where the child becomes autonomous, is a moment where the parent sabotages this by fundamentally preventing that or punishing the child for his tentative to try and individuate. And that punishment is going to be one of the core reasons why the child stays with the parent and feels that they can only have a work with the parent, is because they're stuck with them. So this is where the moral defense becomes completely important for the child, because by taking all the bad, in a way, they're trying very hard to make the parent good. And so then the parent can go back to try and help them. So there you go, why the moral defense kicks in at that point. And third of all, the introjection, because normally what happens in a healthy family is that the child is going to build upon all the good, helpful, loving memories and all the limits, benevolent limits they're going to put on them. Like, for example, a mother might say, no, you don't eat the candy bar now, you'll eat it after the meal, right? Or you'll eat it tomorrow morning at breakfast. And all those acts of love, of care, the child is going to slowly build a strong sense of self with what is wrong and what is right. A strong sense of self that make them more prone to separate and individuate than the child that has bad experiences. Because bad experiences will dampen down the rare good ones that they have, and they don't have enough good experiences with the parent to be able to really differentiate and leave the parent. So fundamentally, the introjection is incomplete when we talk about the bartered woman and the abuser. So for Celani, that lack of differentiation, of introjection and individuation is going to lead the individual to develop personality disorder as a form of adaptation to a bad environment. That in a way, because there's not enough good memories of the parent, of the relationship, of themselves, what's going to happen is that the child is going to have to just fulfill their drives, and fulfilling their drives is going to occur in two different ways for men and women. In a passive way for women and an active way for women. So for men, an active way for men. So active and passive are not to be understood in the Freudian sense. Here it's a sense of David Celani. The passive way for women is trying to seek the relationship, to fix sins, to feel a sense of security. And the men, in an active way, through actions, through acting out, and through, unfortunately, violence. So passive and active are also for Celani synonymous with passive being borderline and active being narcissistic. I said it's men are active and women are passive. This is an oversimplification, right? It's a generalization that works like X% of the time, but not all the time. And Celani is very nuanced on this, but he does say that because our society is built in such a way that men are pushed to be active and women are more pushed to be passive, that's the boxes people tend to fall into, but it's not like an absolute rule, right? Anyway, through that, the men are going to act out because of the feeling of deprivation. They will turn violent. So Celani does analyze why men beat women. So for him, it's because they've had so much frustration and not so little good memories that they just can't deal with anything frustrating. So they will beat the women because they internally see them as the frustrating parent. And the women, they will endure that because, unfortunately, of the moral defense, where they feel that they deserve it, which is wrong, but still they might feel that. And also because they're splitting, they are cutting away their representation of themselves and of their abuser. So here we have two forms of, unfortunately, of disorders that merge together to create a whole system in which society is responsible, but it's also powerlessness to address. As Celani points out, even medical doctors are very, very distant towards that issue. They don't really know how to deal with it. They don't talk about it. I'm saying that because he writes about it at the beginning of the book. So we can see the complexity of it, of this dynamic. So how do we help those people? Well, for Celani, battered women are much more helpable than abusive men. So women are more helpable because they're looking for a relationship. They're very prone to being passive in that relationship. Psychotherapy is something that they can adhere to because they're trying to find something security. So psychotherapy is a good match because the therapist is going to be secure. But what the therapist has to understand is that security is also going to be harmed by the hopeful self, because the hopeful self will always want to go back to the abuser. And it can be very, very strange because you might think, well, yes, but she's going to be hurt. Yes, but at that moment where the hopeful self is active, she doesn't have the full extent of what has happened in her mind. It's only when there's the abused self that she grasps everything that has occurred to the fullest. So that's one of the reasons why it can be complicated. So it's easier to work with the abused self than it is with the hopeful self. So he does say that there's also, it's very much harder, it's infinitely more difficult to work with abusive men, because abusive men are not going to take too well to therapy. Often they come, and as he explains it, because of a court order, because a court ruled it. So they're not very happy about it, and they might be pseudo taking part in the psychotherapy, but it's pseudo. They're not. What he says is that secretly what they want is to kill the therapist rather than work on themselves, and they just submit into it because a higher authority has deemed that they have to do it. And he also says that unfortunately some of them are psychopathic, meaning they don't even care about the harm that they're doing. That's how they are. They're mentally framed as like they have the power and they're going to abuse the power. So very bad prognosis for men, but much better for women. However, he is very clear on the fact that this prognosis is not good enough because we as a society have to change things. And he says that unless we do drastic change to how we conceive of families, how we conceive of helping children and preventing adults from abuse, then we will never be able to heal every battered woman. We won't be able to, even if everyone had access to a psychologist, even if every session was free, even, we wouldn't be able to solve the situation, because he says we have to get there to the very root of what is happening, rather than trying to fix what is already broken. Even though it's still very important, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything, we absolutely should, but he's saying that for real deep societal change we need to act before that. Is, as we would say in French, mieux vaut prévenir que guérir, meaning better us warn and prevent rather than heal and fix afterwards. So this book is very, very important. I feel that It's one of those books which needs to be read if you're interested in the topic, if you have patience, or if you yourself have experienced contact with bartered women. I think that this book is an absolute must, as it allows you to have a global understanding of the psyche, of the processes going on within the mind of both the women and the men. And also it allows you to fundamentally get a picture that is very good, because Celani does not guilt trip anyone. He doesn't victim blame. He doesn't put responsibility upon these women. He's very clear about that, and I found that very good, that he's even addressing the issue of society as a whole. So I found him very, very good, and even if he does criticize the main fairy, he does it very well, and I can only agree with his clinical analysis of phenomena. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you liked it, please feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.